Welcome to Kitchen Sink Dharma, and the theme this week is generosity. So in early Buddhist teachings, generosity was seen as being foundational, and it was often the first teaching that the Buddha would offer someone when they came to join his community. And he once said, if we knew the value of a single act of generosity, we would never miss an opportunity to practice it. So why is generosity such a big deal? Okay, so we talk a lot about letting go, and if we can learn to let go, we can be less attached, and that leads us towards a state of freedom. But of course, it's easier said than done. It's very easy to bring a strong sense of self-judgment into our practice. And letting go can become a big project, and we can end up judging ourselves on our ability to let go, and that can lead us to even greater frustration. It can solidify our clinging, it can drive it underground. There's a much easier approach than saying to yourself you should just let go, or scolding yourself when that doesn't work. So rather than just letting go, we're actually cultivating the conditions of mind that allow us to let go, that allow things to fall away. And that's why we practice qualities like friendliness and generosity and compassion. It actually creates more space. It helps us to loosen the grip of identification. And it really offers an antidote to clinging, and a way of seeing through the illusion of a separate self. So if we can practice these qualities, the kindness, the compassion and so on, it's not so much about letting go, it's just about our whole self-centered obsessions and our grabbing onto things just starts to fall away by itself. It just starts to dissolve. Now, craving and clinging are traditionally associated in Buddhism with stress and suffering. And on the other hand, acts of renunciation, acts of generosity, lead us in the opposite direction. They actually alleviate our stress and our suffering. And the reason for that is it's actually impossible to be truly happy when we're grasping at anything. And we see this really clearly if we actually bring mindfulness to our day-to-day experience and notice our impulses. You can actually try this as a form of insight practice and actually notice how it feels physically in the body when we're being generous. And equally, how does it feel when we're withholding? And what's the actual feeling tone associated with each of these behaviors? You actually notice how generosity affects the state of the heart and the mind. Or for that matter, how does stinginess affect the state of the heart and the mind? Because if you actually think about the joyless feelings associated with withholding, when our actions are the complete opposite of generous, and it could be withholding anything, it might be holding back attention or kindness or love. Notice how much storytelling goes on, how much justification, how much rationalizing happens. We feel much more separate from other people. We actually feel much less secure in ourselves. And equally, it's possible to tune into the feelings around the happiness of generosity. And again, notice what happens in the heart and the mind. And we can see that happiness can actually be the motivating force behind generosity, much more than a sense that we should be generous or that we ought to be generous. And the 11th century monk Shantideva actually taught that whatever you're doing, you should ask yourself, what's the state of my mind? In doing this, what is the state of my mind? So generosity, we can see this as an essential part of spiritual practice in a way. Without it, any practice is a bit meaningless. Now, in the early Buddhist teachings, there are two Pali words for generosity. The first one, which is probably the better known one, is dana, D-A-N-A, and it describes the act of generosity, actual act of giving. There's another word, kaga, C-A-G-A, and that describes the inner disposition towards generosity. So it has connotations of renunciation. It's the part within ourselves that gives us the volition to actually be generous. So you'll often come across the term non-clinging. And in Pali, there's a lot of concepts that are described as negatives, the absence of something. So this is the absence of clinging on to something. And for me, the term non-clinging is often a lot more helpful than talking about letting go, because it actually describes a pathway of development, a pathway of practice. In fact, it offers us material for a whole lifetime's worth of practice. And there's a lot of subtleties in generosity and renunciation. Arising from that, the implications of not clinging to things can be life-changing. absolutely transformational. It's actually the ground on which any other wholesome qualities are built. It's the foundation, it's the basis for kindness and compassion. And in a way, it's a doorway to understanding the way that our ego operates, the way that we're constantly creating this brittle, separate sense of self. And that sense of self is so much built around what we have and what we don't have. You know, we can all be very ungenerous. We can all think unkind thoughts. And if we look at what actually lies behind that, it's often a sense of insufficiency. It's a sense of scarcity, a sense of thinking that we're not enough. And that sense of scarcity becomes actually embedded in the ego, embedded in the sense of self, just feelings of insufficiency, stories about what we're lacking. These things really generate craving and possessiveness and insecurity and anxiety. If we try and organize every moment around maximizing our comfort, maximizing what we have, it doesn't actually work. And that whole torment of insufficiency is absolutely endless. It'll just keep going until the rest of your life. And it makes us forget our ethics. It actually undermines our deepest aspirations. And it can fill us with self-pity, and it can make us miserable, it can make us resentful. Now, we tend not to see resentment and grumpiness as being that much of a problem, but they really are. They take us to a particular way of being in the world, where we're constantly pushing away what we don't want, and we're constantly pursuing what we do want, what we're craving. And it puts intolerance and the sense of wanting before anything ethical, anything to do with our values. And it's a waste of our precious energy, because it actually only leads us to becoming more possessive and more anxious. And we end up believing our well-being actually depends on being able to satisfy every single desire. These are old patterns, these are residual habit patterns, and they run deep. And there's a training that supports a much easier and much more content way of being in the world, and it starts with generosity. And that's why generosity is such a core practice. It's actually concerned with our willingness to embrace discomfort, but it's also concerned with joy. So it's understandable that we fear loss, we fear being taken advantage of, we fear being overwhelmed, and life can be very depleting sometimes. Sometimes it's absolutely right to say, I can't offer anything right now. But we also underestimate our reserves of compassion and care. And they're not limited, they're actually self-replenishing. It's very natural to feel as though we can't afford to be generous, that we don't have enough energy, we don't have enough time or money. Maybe we don't feel we have anything to offer at all. But withholding can become a habit. And we can start practicing in very small ways that don't have to deplete us at all. We can start practicing generosity. And here's something important that's often misunderstood about generosity. We don't actually have to feel generous to start to incline towards generosity. We can just get on with it. We can just circumvent the impulse to withhold if we need to. And then we can just go out and be friendly and be generous. We don't have to wait until we feel generous to be generous. It's just a commitment. It's about nurturing certain qualities. And if our motives are not perfect, it's not a big problem. The starting point might be a very mixed set of motives. But that's no reason to wait. So we practice generosity in order to incline in the right direction. And it's closely connected with the path factor of wise intention. In terms of the Eightfold Path in Buddhist teaching, wise intention is very much linked with generosity. Wise intention actually encompasses not being greedy, not being full of hatred, not being cruel, and the whole desire to help other beings and not to harm them. So we may be imperfect, we might be underdeveloped in that respect, but simply committing to practice generosity is a good enough starting point. And it's incredible how many situations come up every day that ask for generosity. And they're mostly small things. They're not necessarily going to make you famous. I'm talking about the small day-to-day examples here. So generosity doesn't require us to be completely reckless. It doesn't require us to give everything away or to throw ourselves into a state of poverty. That's not necessarily generosity. That's just as likely to be grandiosity. We can start small. We can start consciously bringing benefit to others in our immediate vicinity. Maybe just deliberately widening our circle of concern a little bit and noticing how that feels. And this helps us to see the world from a very different point of view. It's all about what we have and what we can give rather than what we lack. So it reinforces a sense of sufficiency. And of course, generosity means freely giving or sharing whatever we have to give. Most opportunities to practice generosity don't actually involve money. They often involve giving someone our full attention, for example. They might involve listening, encouraging, being with somebody, offering our presence. They might simply involve being patient with someone. It might be about looking for the best in people, treating everyone as worthy of your respect and your care. And this is from a book called How Can I Help by Ram Dass and Paul Gorman. They wrote, "There's no place special we have to be in order to help out. Right where we are, in whatever we're already doing, the opportunity to be of service is almost always present. We need only stay conscious and aware, and then give whatever we can to whoever is right there." That's from Ram Dass and Paul Gorman. Generosity involves recognition of another being. So when we're lost in craving and grasping, we're really only recognizing ourselves and our own desires. And the very act of benefiting someone else can make you stand outside yourself for a little bit of time. And I remember years ago, back when my wife Elaine was still alive, she'd taken the dog out for an early morning walk. And she was out for ages. And I was starting to wonder where she'd got to. And when she came back, she told me she got talking to a teenager on the seafront, and she'd end up giving him her coat and a £10 note that she had on her. And it was one of those, "You did what?" moments. When she told the story, I knew she'd done the right thing. So this kid was homeless, he'd been kicked out by his family, didn't have anywhere to stay, and she hadn't just given him her coat and the £10, she'd also given him her full attention. She'd listened to his story. It's like I said, she was out for ages. And she'd suggested where he could get some help. She told him about a local project. And she didn't make a big thing of it. I don't actually remember her ever bringing it up again. And that really reminds me of something that the Buddha said about the way that you give. This is from the Majjhima Nikaya. And how is a person of integrity in the way that he or she gives a gift? A person of integrity gives a gift attentively, with their own hand, respectfully, not as if throwing it away, but with the view that something will come of it. So we all carry a burden, and generosity is a practice that lightens that burden. It helps us to understand that we're all interconnected with each other and with the earth, and it opens the heart. I can't imagine what life would be like without it. So thank you for listening, and hopefully you can join me again in the near future.